Well, folks, let me tell you about a story about a man named Denis Kiryeyev. Now Denis, he was a 45-year-old banker from Kyiv, and he had a bit of a checkered past, you see. He had ties to them wealthy brothers with connections to Russia-aligned Ukrainian politicians and even the president of Ukraine himself, Viktor Yanukovych. Now, Yanukovych, he wasn't exactly the most popular feller in Ukraine, what with his Russian ties and all. But Denis, he didn't seem to mind. He was working for him, trying to make a living like the rest of us. But then, something strange happened. The Ukraine Security Service accused Denis of spying for Moscow, and they killed him for it. But as it turns out, Denis was a hero all along. He had been passing on information from his Russian contacts that helped Ukraine defend their capital city. Can you believe it? The man they thought was a traitor was actually a patriot. President Zelensky, he recognized Denis' heroism and awarded him a posthumous medal for his service to the state. But why was Denis spying in the first place? Well, it seems that Russia had invested billions of dollars to infiltrate Ukraine's political and intelligence circles. They were trying to divide loyalties within Ukraine's spy agencies and establish a network of agents in case of a potential invasion. And Denis, with his ties to both sides, was the perfect man for the job. He had connections with European intelligence services, Russian military and government officials, and even agreed to represent Kyiv in early ceasefire talks between Russia and Ukraine. It was a high-risk and high-profile mission, but Denis seemed to enjoy it. His friends said he loved playing the role of a spy. But when the invasion came on February 24, Denis' loyalty was put to the test. And he passed with flying colors. He gave his life to protect his country and his people. And for that, we will always be grateful. Denis Kiryeyev may have had a questionable reputation, but in the end, he proved to be a true patriot and hero. And he was buried as such, next to Ukraine's first foreign minister. When Ukraine was in the midst of a war fought between their own forces and Russia-backed militias. It all started back in 2014, with a little thing we call a citizen uprising. The people of Ukraine were fed up with their government and they weren't going to take it anymore. They took to the streets, protesting and rioting until the president, Yanukovych, had to flee to Russia. And that's when the real trouble began. Russia, seeing an opportunity, seized Crimea and stirred up rebellion in the east of Ukraine. And before you knew it, there was a full-blown war going on. But amidst all this chaos, there was a man named Mr. Kiryeyev. Now, Mr. Kiryeyev was a businessman with ties to both Russian and Ukrainian business and security, and he saw an opportunity to do something for his country. He purchased equipment for volunteer brigades fighting on behalf of Kyiv, and even expressed his disappointment with Ukraine's inability to reach its potential due to interference from Russia. However, as the war continued, Mr. Kiryeyev's allegiance to his country was questioned. In 2019, when Mr. Zelensky was elected president, Mr. Kiryeyev was considered for a top position at a state-controlled bank, but missed out due to concerns of his loyalty. But in 2021, with Russia building up troops on the border, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence agency, General Budanov, saw an opportunity to use Mr. Kiryeyev's connections to infiltrate Russia's military intelligence. And Mr. Kiryeyev, being a patriotic man, agreed to participate. Mr. Kiryeyev, he spent his time gathering intelligence and providing it to General Budanov. He even learned from his sources that Russia was planning to invade Ukraine, and he was the first to sound the alarm. And with an invasion looking imminent, millions of Ukrainians were fleeing the country. But Mr. Kiryeyev, he decided not to go. He couldn't look himself in the eye if he did. Instead, he provided intelligence to General Budanov that allowed Ukraine to shift troops and ultimately damage the Antonov airport beyond use for the invading forces. Russia and Ukraine even arranged for ceasefire talks in Belarus, and General Budanov even asked Mr. Kiryeyev to attend due to his connections with two members of the Russian delegation. Mr. Kiryeyev was hesitant, seeing as how he had relationships on both sides of the border, but in the end, he decided to go for the sake of his country. He joined the negotiating team with Ukraine's defense minister and other officials, but didn't even tell his wife who was still abroad. But his participation in the negotiations made his connection with special services obvious to everyone, according to General Budanov. And he knew the risks he was taking, but he did it anyway. Days later, he even told a friend that he had used a hunting rifle to shoot at Russian operatives who had approached his property. When Russia and Ukraine agreed to a second round of talks, General Budanov asked for participation of Mr. Kiryeyev again. And that's when things took a turn for the worse. On the night before the negotiations in Belarus, Mr. Kiryeyev received a phone call from the office of Alexander Poplet, the counterintelligence chief at the SBU. According to General Budanov, Poplet wanted to meet him. Mr. Kiryeyev drove to a Kyiv train station with his personal security crew and military intelligence agents for his trip to Belarus. He even told the bodyguards he might be arrested en route. The group stopped near St. Sophia Cathedral, where several minivans with SBU agents pulled up and ordered the military intelligence agents and Mr. Kiryeyev's bodyguards to surrender their weapons. Mr. Kiryeyev was directed to a minivan and driven away. About 90 minutes later, the military intelligence agents were summoned to the spot where they found Mr. Kiryeyev's body. Mr. Kiryeyev was killed on the night before the negotiations in Belarus, and the details of how and why remains a mystery. The State Bureau of Investigation of Ukraine declined to comment on the case. But in the following months, the government in Kyiv worked to root out Russian accomplices in the security services. President Zelensky fired the SBU chief and removed or prosecuted dozens of the agency's generals for their alleged role in facilitating the Russian invasion. Ukraine even opened more than 650 treason cases involving government officials. Mr. Kiryeyev was buried with military honors in Kyiv's Baikov cemetery. His widow briefly returned to the city in December and visited his grave 3 times before leaving the country.